A young father and mother are found dead in a car at a cottage in Castle Rock, Wisconsin. The man is sitting in the driver's seat, and the woman is found in the trunk. Officials arrive and quickly determine that Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan have succumbed to carbon monoxide fumes that have been funneled into the car through a vacuum hose, apparently all set up by the deceased pair themselves. Combined, the two young parents had a total of 6 children. 4 were Leslie's and 2 were Trevor's. But the couple was not married. They were not even dating. They had been thrust together by deadly circumstances that neither of them ever saw coming. And with their deaths, the oddly connected couple took secrets with them that would remain unknown for decades to come. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we'll be talking about the heartbreaking and frankly hard to even conceive murders of Leslie Howell and Trevor Buchanan. It's a case where the perpetrator reached deep to come up with the most outlandish murder scheme imaginable. It was bold, heartless, frighteningly creative and unusual, but clumsy. And despite all that, carrying out justice for the heinous crime would look far different than you would ever expect. So join us as we cover this suspense-filled case that's riddled with astronomically warped thinking. And before we get started, if you end up liking how we present this case, we'd love it if you can click like, subscribe, and preferably share. We appreciate you. Let's go. Colin Howell was born in 1959 and grew up amid intense political and religious conflict in Belfast, Ireland. The city was deeply divided between Catholic nationalists and Protestant loyalists. Despite the unrest, or perhaps as a result of it, many of the Irish turned to their religious communities for comfort and security. Colin's parents were no exception. They were evangelical Baptists who aimed to instill the importance of faith in their son. Growing up, Colin attended 3 church services every Sunday and was an active member of a Christian youth organization called the Boys Brigade. As a teenager, he aspired to become a missionary and sought the respect of his fellow churchgoers. However, his deep commitment to his beliefs often set him apart from his peers, leading him to become a loner. While his friends frequented clubs and pubs, Colin stayed home, perceiving such places as sinful. Yet despite his outward godliness, Colin struggled with inner conflicts. And as he grew older, the conflicts became more pronounced. In 1978, at the age of 19, he began buying pornographic magazines, quickly developing an obsession. It's suspected that his inner turmoil and guilt led him to abandon his aspirations of becoming a missionary. By the time he finished secondary school, Colin had decided to pursue a career in medicine, aiming to help people in a different capacity. But he was not academically strong enough to get into medical school, so he opted for dentistry as a more attainable goal. Colin enrolled in a dentistry program at Queen's University in Belfast, where he studied for 6 years. Throughout his time in college, he continued to attend church regularly. In 1980, he caught the eye of a fellow parishioner named Leslie Clark. Born in Plymouth in March 1960, Leslie had 1 brother, and both of them pursued careers in the health sector, with Chris studying anesthesiology and Leslie becoming a nurse. It was during her nursing studies that she met Colin, who was placed at a nearby hospital. The couple was attracted to each other, a case of opposites attract. While Colin was quiet and reserved, Leslie was outgoing and sociable. The two quickly fell for each other and began dating. In 1982, a few years into their relationship, things took an unexpected turn when Leslie became pregnant. The news sent the virtuous Colin into a spiral. An unplanned pregnancy out of wedlock was a significant and public sin, unlike his previous addiction to pornographic magazines, which he could hide. Dealing with this situation would require an act even more taboo than premarital sex: abortion. Faced with the dilemma of abiding by his beliefs and keeping the baby, or preserving his godly image and secretly terminating the pregnancy, Colin chose to preserve his image. Although Leslie was hesitant about having an abortion, she feared that Colin would leave her if she didn't do it. So the couple traveled to London, where abortions were legal, to terminate the pregnancy. Then, despite the moral, emotional, and logistical toll that the termination took on the couple, just a few months after they returned, Leslie was pregnant again, landing them in the exact same situation they were just in. With the devout Christian not wanting to admit he was having sex before marriage, Colin pressured Leslie into having another abortion. They returned to London to repeat the procedure. Then, just a few weeks after returning from the second termination, Leslie was pregnant again, back to London for her third pregnancy termination in a matter of months. After Colin graduated from dental school, he and Leslie got married and relocated to Coleraine, a charming village on Northern Ireland's northern coast. Colin secured employment at a local dental practice while Leslie continued her nursing career. Initially, their life seemed perfect, with stable jobs and a comfortable lifestyle. In October 1984, Leslie gave birth to their first child, Matthew. The period marked a significant shift in their lives. Colin's flourishing dental career allowed Leslie to leave her nursing job and focus on raising their child. The Howells were active members of their local Baptist church, where Colin took on leadership roles, including heading the youth fellowship and volunteering with children's groups. These roles satisfied his desire for religious authority and community respect. But the dynamics at home were less harmonious. Leslie struggled with her new role as a stay-at-home mother, longing to return to her nursing career. Colin, however, expected her to adhere to traditional homemaker responsibilities. The tension was compounded with the birth of their second child, Lauren, in November of 1986, further increasing the demands on Leslie. The following year, Colin decided to advance his career by purchasing office space and opening his own dental practice. While the venture underscored his professional success, it did little to alleviate the unhappiness in his marriage. Colin hired a second dentist, and his clientele quickly grew. The practice's success prompted Colin to stretch his finances to the limit by purchasing a large house in 1989. That was the same year they welcomed their third child, Daniel. The large house reinforced Colin's image as a family man within their church community. But despite the outward appearance the house reflected, reality was the opposite. While the house was indeed spacious, and Colin's dental practice was thriving, the financial strain that the large mortgage and 3 kids placed on the family resulted in the home being incomplete and lacking basic amenities like carpeting. And it seemed to be in a constant state of renovation. Leslie began to feel overwhelmed by the mounting responsibilities and the financial burden imposed by Colin's decisions. She started fantasizing about escaping the situation and reportedly began saving money in case she ever decided to leave her husband. And her desire to leave became stronger than ever when she found out that Colin was having an affair with a former classmate from the university. While Colin was well aware that his infidelity violated one of the 10 commandments, he rationalized that it was preferable to a divorce, just as he had once chosen abortion over the public shame of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. When Leslie discovered the affair, she confronted both Colin and his mistress, and they supposedly stopped seeing each other. But Leslie had had enough and was ready to end it. However, before she managed to leave the relationship, she became pregnant with their 4th child. The new pregnancy intensified their marital conflicts, and Colin soon found yet another woman to fill his needs. It was this new relationship that would shape the future for everyone involved. Enter Hazel Buchanan. Hazel was a friendly, attractive, married nursery school assistant. Her husband, Trevor Buchanan, was a police officer. The couple had 2 children and attended the same church as the Howells. Hazel had started working as a nursery school assistant to escape the monotony of her life at home, one where her husband would often work long hours, leaving Hazel feeling neglected and isolated. It was while Colin was taking his 3-year-old daughter to a playgroup that he met Hazel. Colin and Hazel would attend regular swimming lessons organized by the church. Hazel's interactions with Colin became the highlight of her day. During one of the lessons, Colin apologized to Hazel for not having innocent thoughts about her. Hazel replied, "Well, I'm not that innocent myself." Colin went to her house later to teach her how to play the guitar, and he said she answered the door in a short denim skirt and sleeveless low-cut blouse. He said, "I knew I wasn't there for guitar lessons." The two started an affair that took place not just in their homes, but in Colin's dentist's chair and at secluded spots like Castle Row Forest Park. Then, in August of 1990, Hazel discovered that she was pregnant. Uncertain whether the father was Colin or her husband, she turned to Colin for a solution. His suggestion? A trip to London for a procedure that he was more than familiar with. As Colin continued his affair with Hazel, Leslie grew increasingly suspicious and confided her concerns to their pastor. The pastor had already been suspicious since a church elder had previously reported seeing Colin and Hazel together at Castle Row Forest Park. When the pastor confronted Colin, he denied the accusations, claiming to be a good Christian who would never cheat on his spouse. Unconvinced, the pastor visited Hazel's home and she promptly confessed to the affair. The pastor advised the couple to be truthful to everyone involved, including both Leslie and Trevor. They did. Each of them informed their respective spouses of the affair but minimized the extent of it, claiming that it was purely emotional and not physical. Colin was stripped of his church volunteer roles, and the couples began receiving counseling through the church, along with strict guidelines they were required to follow. Trevor was devastated but was eager to move past the affair and repair his marriage. However, Leslie, who had just had her fourth child, struggled to forgive, with this being the second time she had learned of her husband having an affair. She withdrew into a deep depression. She began taking antidepressants and drinking more heavily, a practice that she had begun to a lesser extent after she found out about Colin's first affair. A few weeks later, Colin revealed to Leslie that his affair with Hazel had indeed been sexual. The revelation was the final straw for Leslie. In a fit of rage, she attacked Colin before locking herself in the bathroom. She then ingested a large quantity of acetaminophen, attempting to then drove off, leaving a note behind that would eventually play a pivotal role in Colin's future plans. Colin called for help and Leslie was found unharmed. She spent 3 days in the hospital recovering. After that, both Colin and Leslie appeared to genuinely try to repair their marriage. But that only lasted a few months before, unsurprisingly, Colin returned to seeing Hazel. It was around that time in late April of 1991 that Leslie's father moved into the couple's home to help Leslie care for the children. Not long after he moved in, Leslie and Colin returned home from an evening at the theater to find her father, who had been suffering from flu-like symptoms, collapse on the kitchen floor. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late. Examinations revealed that he had died from a heart attack. Leslie was shattered. The tragedy further reduced her support system and led her to increasingly rely on alcohol to cope. By that point, the couple's marriage was on the brink of collapse, but fearing the public stigma of a divorce, they continued to stay married. That was until Colin came up with a plan. Much like his earlier decisions to conceal premarital pregnancies with secret abortions, he sought another way out. On May 19, 1991, at around 8:30 a.m., a church elder received a phone call from Colin Howell. Colin informed him that Leslie had not been home since last night and that her car was gone. The elder rushed to the Howells' home. Colin told him that he thought Leslie might have gone off with Trevor Buchanan and asked for help in finding them. He suggested that they might be at some cottages called the 12 Apostles. The elder drove to the cottage Colin specified but didn't see Leslie or Trevor. He returned to the Howells' home and relayed his findings, noting, though, that he had not checked the garage. So Colin called another church elder asking again to check the cottage. The elder drove to the location and didn't see anyone inside the house, but noticed a car in the garage with its driver's door open. But before he could investigate, he was distracted by what he thought was movement in an upstairs window. Suspecting that it was Trevor and Leslie, he called up to them, didn't receive a response, then returned back to the house to tell Colin. Then, a few hours later, Colin asked the first elder to return to the cottage to check again, this time providing him with the keys to the property. The elder decided to take a police officer with him this time. After searching the home again, they checked the garage. There, they discovered the bodies of Trevor and Leslie. They checked for signs of life, but there were none. Authorities were called to the scene. Leslie's car had been reversed into the garage. Trevor's body was in the driver's seat, and Leslie was in the trunk. A vacuum cleaner pipe was found near Leslie's head, loosely connected to the car's exhaust pipe. In the trunk, Leslie had on headphones connected to a Walkman and was surrounded by family photos. A forensic medical officer pronounced both Trevor and Leslie dead at 2:15 p.m., noting that they had likely been dead for at least 12 hours. Forensic examinations determined that both victims died from carbon monoxide poisoning. That finding, along with the accounts from Colin and Hazel, led authorities to conclude that the deceased pair, distraught over their spouse's affair, made a pact to end it all in the garage of that cottage. But had they? There were several indications that something more sinister may have been at play, starting with evidence that was clearly apparent at the scene, like the position of the driver's seat. The driver's seat where Trevor was sitting was positioned far too forward for Trevor's legs to fit properly. He would not have driven the car in such a cramped position. So, whoever actually drove the car to its destination was likely much shorter than Trevor. Colin Howell was significantly shorter than Trevor. Trevor's legs were so ill-fitting that one of his feet was actually dangling outside of the open car door, which led to another clue. Despite a hose being rigged to pump the deadly fumes into the car, Trevor's foot dangling out of the door meant that the car door was left open, and even the car window was left open as well. An ineffective way to trap fumes in the car. And although the scene was intended to look as though the couple had made a pact to end everything together, why were they separated? It seemed highly unusual that such a pact would result in them being in separate parts of the car. The more likely scenario would have been for them to both be in the front seats side by side. Also suspicious was that Leslie's shoes were only partially on her feet, which would have been a highly unlikely way for her to enter the trunk herself. And then there were the injuries. Photographs of Trevor post-mortem showed that he sustained injuries to his mouth and his nose, and there was blood coming from the back of his head. Colin explained that Trevor had been involved in a minor skirmish earlier, which authorities accepted. Blood was even found on Trevor's sweatshirt, but it was never examined to see who it belonged to. Additionally, Colin himself had a cut on his forehead. He told the authorities that he had bumped his head. And remember how Colin insisted that the elders check the cottage. Despite his 3 separate attempts to direct elders to the place where the victims would eventually be found, authorities failed to ask him why he was so insistent or how he knew. And then there was the issue of Colin and Hazel's credibility. Despite authorities knowing that both Colin and Hazel had lied to them about certain aspects of their affair, they still considered them credible witnesses and relied on their statements about what happened. There was also relevant information that authorities dismissed. They remain aware that Colin may have attempted to murder Leslie on a previous occasion. Friends of Leslie's reported that he had recently dropped an electric cable into her bathwater while she was in it. And of course, there was money. Colin was in dire financial straits, but investigators did not look into the possibility of a financial motive for the deaths, including the existence of life insurance policies on both of the victims. But all of these eye-raising clues were not lost on everyone. At least 2 people expressed concerns to authorities about Trevor's injuries, and even one of the police officers shared his suspicion that Colin may be involved. But none of it was enough to combat the word of the charming, respected local dentist, with his strong Christian ties and reputation. In addition to all of the clues that were ignored, the investigation suffered several other procedural lapses. There was no scene log, and no sketches or measurements were taken. The deaths were ruled as self-inflicted, the case was closed, and paperwork was filed, and subsequently, lost. They had done it. Colin Howell and Hazel Buchanan had gotten away with murdering their spouses. Once Colin had come to the conclusion that his marriage was over, he devised a plan. One that would rid him of the spouses that were standing in the way of his romance, as well as net him the cash he needed to get out of debt. Ever since he had discovered the note Leslie left behind following her ingestion of the pills, he envisioned how he could incorporate it into his grand plan. He finally shared that grand plan with Hazel in the middle of 1991, explaining that the future of their relationship depended on them ending their marriages, but not through divorce. Hazel agreed. Then, on the night of May 18th, the day of his youngest son's 2nd birthday, Colin set his plan into motion. He wedged a hockey stick underneath his children's bedroom door to prevent them from leaving their rooms. Then he waited until Leslie fell asleep in the lounge of their home, which was where she normally slept, given the collapse of their marriage. Earlier that day, Colin had cut off the ends of a baby bottle and used the remaining portion to connect a hose to their car's exhaust pipe. Once Leslie was asleep, he retrieved the connected hose from the garage, let it into the lounge, started the car engine, and left the room. But then, concerned that the fumes were not filling the room quickly enough, he came back into the room and tucked the hose under his wife's blanket close to her face. As the fumes began to take effect, Leslie stirred and started to wake up, calling out the name of their eldest son, Matthew. Colin acted swiftly. Holding her down, he pulled the blanket over her head and held it there, making sure she had no opportunity to escape the lethal gas. After Leslie stopped moving and Colin was certain she was dead, he turned off the car engine. He then placed her body in the trunk of their car and called Hazel and said, "I'm finished with Leslie. Is everything ready?" Colin then drove through the darkness to Hazel's house. Prior to that night, he had provided Hazel the sedative to give to Trevor before he arrived. She did. She had crushed the pills and mixed them into a tuna sandwich for him. He quickly became drowsy and went to bed after eating it. She then made sure that their children were asleep and let Colin know that Trevor was sedated. Colin arrived at their home and backed the car into the garage. He proceeded to Hazel's bedroom, where Trevor was in a deep sleep. Like he had just done at his own home, he took a prepared hose from the garage, ran it through the house, and positioned it near Trevor's mouth. Confident in his ability to overpower the heavily sedated Trevor, Colin did not restrain him. He started the car, allowing the carbon monoxide to flow through the hose and into Trevor's lungs. But, like Leslie, Trevor began to stir, prompting Colin to jump on him and hold the hose in place. Despite the sedative and the carbon monoxide exposure, the seasoned police officer fought back. The struggle intensified, with both men wrestling on the floor, the hose spewing toxic fumes into the room. Colin, momentarily dizzy from inhaling the fumes himself, managed to regain control. He forced the hose back into Trevor's mouth, pulling a blanket over his head and pinning his arms down as he watched Trevor succumb to the gas and die. Hazel stood on the other side of the closed bedroom door during the entire ordeal, according to her, covering her ears. After ensuring Trevor was dead, Colin changed Trevor out of his pajamas and into the clothes Hazel had laid out. Then he placed him in the car next to Leslie's body. Hazel's next role was to clean up the evidence. She cut the hose into sections and burned them in the fireplace. Colin didn't come away from the attack unscathed. Even though he didn't inhale a fatal dose of the carbon monoxide, he did have some of the nausea and dizziness that exposure can cause. He stumbled outside for fresh air, but couldn't afford to rest. He still had a lot of work to do. He was no stranger to concealing his wrongdoings, but he needed this cover-up to be perfect. He was responsible for handling the bodies, and Hazel was responsible for taking care of the scene, including burning the hose in the fireplace, cleaning the floor, and washing the bed linen. Colin had worn surgical gloves, but he knew how trace evidence could be left behind, so he insisted on a thorough cleaning. He drove the bodies to the empty cottage that had belonged to Leslie's recently deceased father. There, he arranged Trevor's body in the driver's seat and Leslie's in the trunk, positioning her with headphones on and family photos beside her to make it appear as though she had died peacefully, listening to music. He also left the old note that Leslie had written back at their home, confident that he could use it later to support his cover-up. He then connected a vacuum cleaner hose to the car's exhaust and ran it into the vehicle, turned on the engine, closed the garage, and left the scene, hoping that it would look like the two distraught spouses had made a pact to end it all together. Then he retrieved a bike that he had previously hidden nearby and rode it home. Given the official ruling on Trevor and Leslie's deaths, their surviving spouses were ready to collect. Between Leslie's life insurance, will, and an endowment from her father's estate, Colin collected a total of about £414,000, equivalent to about $575,000 US. More than enough to solve his financial problems. Hazel received £130, or about $180,000 US from insurance, as well as subsequent payouts from her husband's police pension. After their spouses' deaths, the surviving murderers took about a 6-week break from their relationship, then secretly resumed it. But it wasn't the same. Hazel was racked with guilt, to the point of struggling to be intimate with Colin. But once again, Colin comes through with a solution. Unwilling to let their romance cool off after everything he had done to be with her, Colin suggested using nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas, to help Hazel relax. While nitrous oxide is intended to be inhaled in dental and medical settings to relax patients, Colin used it to allow him to be intimate with Hazel without any inhibitions. And he didn't stop there. Recognizing Hazel's growing discomfort, he introduced a more powerful sedative, often used before surgeries. Under that sedative, Hazel would have been incapacitated, classifying Colin's actions toward her during that state as assault. The couple's relationship deteriorated to the point where Hazel began refusing to engage with Colin while she contemplated her next steps. So, it was time for answer man Colin to put his thinking cap on again. The solution this time: patience. He decided to assault his patients. Since the sedatives were so effective on Hazel, why not use them to assault his patients, of which he had a plentiful supply? He began administering the powerful pre-surgery sedative to female patients before dental procedures, then groping them while they were sedated and defenseless. Many of his victims were unaware that they had been assaulted due to the memory loss caused by the sedative. But some of them were aware and they spoke out. At least 6 women came forward with allegations against Colin, highlighting his pattern of abuse. Then, in 1996, 5 years after their spouses' deaths and fully out in the open with their relationship, Hazel ended their relationship. The two parted ways and moved on. Hazel went on to meet and marry another police officer, David Stewart, in 2005. They lived in a luxury home outside of Coleraine, where she was a regular in the police community's social scene. It was common to see shots of her in glamorous ball gowns captured by the local press at charity dinners. And Colin moved on as well. Within a year of his breakup with Hazel, the 37-year-old dentist and father of 4 married his second wife, Kyle Jorgensen, just 5 months after meeting her at a Bible study class. She was a 30-year-old former waitress and divorced mother of 2 who had recently moved from America to Ireland after a violent 3-year marriage to her first husband. The couple merged families, and within the year, Kyle was pregnant with their first son, Eric. Then, when Eric was just a few months old, Colin decided that it was time to tell Kyle about his past. As she was feeding their new baby in the kitchen, he confessed to murdering his first wife and his lover's husband. He also divulged that he was currently having another affair. Kyle was initially horrified and urged Colin to turn himself in for the murders, which he considered. But after talking it through, they decided that for their 7 children, it would be best to keep the family together. They agreed to stay quiet. But Colin's revelation still didn't sit well with Kyle. She asked a church friend what she should do if her husband had done something, not fully disclosing what that something was. The man dismissed her concern and replied, "I don't want to hear it. It's before the cross. You shouldn't tell on other people before that time in their life," referring to the teaching that the sins you've committed before finding God are forgiven. Meanwhile, despite Colin claiming that the affair he confessed to was over, he continued to lead a double life behind Kyle's back. Amidst it all, his dental practice and reputation continued to thrive. He expanded into cosmetic dentistry and implants, both highly lucrative fields, with the public unaware of the good dentist's past and current evil acts. Over the next few years, Colin and Kyle had 4 more children together, bringing Colin's total to 9 and 11 between them. Colin's recent professional success enabled him to buy a property in Florida. He was even able to invest nearly £400,000 in a buried treasure investment, where gold was reported to be buried in Philippine caves by Japanese troops in the 1940s. The investment was so promising that Colin began fraudulently swindling money through his practice, claiming to perform procedures he didn't actually perform. He even sold his share in his 2 dental practices to add to his investment. It seemed that all his wrongdoings of the past were behind him. But not forever. In April of 2007, Colin received devastating news about his eldest son, 22-year-old Matthew. Matthew, who was studying for a semester in St. Petersburg, Russia, was calling out to a friend over the railing of his apartment building, and losing his grip, he tragically fell 4 stories onto the concrete below, killing him. Colin was stricken with grief. Shortly after that, he learned that the large buried treasure investment that he had poured all of his and others' money into was a scam. In a desperate attempt to try to salvage some of his investment, he traveled to the Philippines. But all he received was a box containing 2 gold bars worth about £30. He returned to Northern Ireland and explained to Kyle that he had lost £350,000 in a failed scheme, which included savings for their children's education. And, for good measure, he threw in the admission that following Matthew's death, he had renewed his old affair. And, since he was sharing, he included that he was assaulting women while they were sedated at his clinic. The affair admission would be Colin's 3rd strike, counting his 2nd affair that he had fessed up to back in 2003. Outraged, Kyle kicked the murderous serial adulterer out of the house. Penniless and humiliated, Colin continued working as a dentist, but having lost nearly everything, he began to believe that God was punishing him for his past sins. He was convinced that his misfortune would continue until he made things right. And so did Kyle. In January 2009, a month after kicking him out and 10 years after he told her about his murders, Kyle called the church elders to her home to meet with Colin. Kyle begged Colin to confess, telling him, "The truth will set you free." He confessed the killings to the elders, admitting both he and Hazel's involvement. Stunned to learn that Colin was not the upstanding citizen and devout Christian that they believed he was, the elders convinced him to turn himself in, which he did. Shortly afterward, Hazel was also taken into custody. After having gotten away with murder for nearly 2 decades, the truth finally caught up to them. Despite Colin's confession, he pleaded not guilty to the charges, and so did Hazel. Before Colin's trial begins, Kyle filed for divorce and returned to her native America with her 7 children. Having known about the murders for a decade and not reported it, it was unclear whether she would be charged or called for questioning again. Then, just days before Colin's trial was set to begin in 2010, in a surprise move, he changed his plea to guilty for the 2 murders. Later that year, he also pleaded guilty to indecently assaulting 3 women patients. He was facing 14 other assault-related charges reported to have taken place over a span of 10 years, but he denied those. On December 3, 2010, Colin Howell was sentenced to life in prison for the murders with a minimum of 21 years. A few months later, he received an additional 5.5 years for the sexual assaults to be served concurrently with his life sentence. He did not face trial for the reported rape of Hazel. In 2011, Hazel, now going by her married name of Hazel Stewart, stood trial for 2 counts of murder. Present on one side of the courtroom were the children of Leslie Howell, eager to find answers about their mother's death. Hazel's children also attended. Despite losing their father, they chose to stand by their mother. Throughout the trial, Hazel claimed that she was manipulated by Colin and that he was the principal architect of the murders. She claimed that she was not an active participant, but rather a passive victim. However, the prosecution laid out a detailed account of the events leading up to and following the murders. They showed how Hazel was not a bystander, but an active conspirator, outlining how she provided Trevor with a sedative-laced sandwich, guided Colin to the bedroom where Trevor slept, and disposed of the evidence. Most of the details were provided by testimony from Colin himself, who had turned state's witness against his former partner in crime, providing detailed evidence against her. His 4 days of testimony were devastating to her defense. He described that while she may not have understood the plan as thoroughly as he did, she never asked him to stop. He said she initially didn't think they could pull it off, but eventually she fully cooperated. He said that her concern was not about the concept, but about being caught. During his testimony, he also admitted that he may have indeed flicked his wife with a live cable while she was in the bathtub prior to the final murder. He said, "I saw the opportunity to shift the balance of power in our relationship." During his court-ordered psychological exams, Colin noted how his affair is what triggered Leslie to start drinking. He said, "Before the affair, she wasn't like that. She just couldn't cope with the pain I had caused with the affair." The jury also heard some of the 15 taped interviews that Hazel had with investigators when she was first arrested. In them, she outlines her specific roles in the crime, but still claims she was coerced. She described, "Maybe I was easy prey. He's a very calculating person, a very clever guy. I'm not very bright, unfortunately, but he was a step ahead of me the whole time. I thought, if I say something against this, he'll kill me." Throughout the tapes, she changes her account of the events at least 3 times. She also recounted how Colin would give her laughing gas in his dentist chair, and how he once gave her too much so that he could test the limits of how much he could give. Colin confirmed that he had indeed drugged Hazel in an experiment to test the dosage that he would later use on their murder victims. Then he had sex with her while she was unconscious. In March 2011, the jury took just over 2 hours to find 48-year-old Hazel Stewart guilty of both murders. Following the verdicts, police acknowledged that the initial police investigation was deeply flawed, with key evidence overlooked, crucial witness statements not examined, and more. They issued a formal apology to the families of the victims, noting that they regretted the delayed justice and prolonged suffering that their failings caused. Police also conducted a review of their procedures to ensure that sudden deaths undergo a thorough investigation in the future. In light of the true nature of Leslie and Trevor's deaths, the death of Leslie's father, which occurred just 12 days before Leslie and Trevor's murders, was called into question. Colin had used Leslie's father's death as a key point in the cover-up of the murders, stating that Leslie was distraught over his death. So it was reasonable to speculate whether her father's death was also orchestrated by Colin as the initial step of his bigger plan. Colin denied killing Leslie's father, and since the body was cremated, something that Colin insisted that Leslie wanted for her father, there was no way of exhuming it to gather enough evidence to charge Colin. Leslie's brother speculated that Colin may have found out about £212 in Leslie's bank account and hatched the murder plan to get his hands on it. Leslie's relatives believe that her father may have secretly given her those funds to help her escape Colin in the months before she was killed. Leslie had told a friend that she wanted to make sure her husband did not get any money that her father left her, stating that that money is for her and the kids, not for him. For 4 years, Kyle remained under investigation for not reporting the murders during the 10 years that she was aware of them. But she was never charged. Authorities maintained that there wasn't sufficient evidence to provide a reasonable prospect of conviction. Colin Howell is currently serving a life sentence in HMP Maghaberry, a high-security prison in Northern Ireland. Now 64 years old, his involvement in religious activities and knowledge of the Bible has gained him trust and respect among the population. Described as a model prisoner by prison staff, they say that he is consistently polite and mannerly, and always refers to officers as sir. They did, however, note that he likes to think he's not one of the regular criminals. They reported how he applied to be the jail's dentist for all the prisoners. But since he's a convicted murderer and no longer has a license to practice, he was turned down. They said he was furious. They noted that while the prison does have a lot of inmates with dental problems, Colin Howell was not the answer. One prison worker noted how Colin suffered a few spankings when he was returned to the general population after temporarily being moved away for his own safety. Colin was also reported to have gotten into an altercation with one of his inmate friends. Both Colin and the other inmate, who was serving a 22-year sentence for rape and murder, were both known for spreading the gospel to other inmates. They were getting along just fine until they fell out after Colin accused the other inmate of scratching his R. Kelly CD. Colin Howell will be eligible for parole no earlier than the year 2030, at which time he will be 72 years old. Hazel Stewart's life in prison has been less publicized, but she continues to serve her time in Highbank Prison in Belfast. In 2013, she appealed her conviction for the murder of Leslie Howell, but it was dismissed. She also tried to appeal the conviction of the murder of her husband, but upon the advice of her counsel that the appeal was groundless, she dropped it. In 2021, her lawyers were planning to challenge the decision to not prosecute Colin Howell for raping her. If they do end up challenging that decision, and if she were to win, they may appeal her conviction again, arguing that because she was raped, she was not in a fit state of mind to know what she was doing when she participated in the murders. Barring any such successful appeal, she will be eligible for parole no sooner than 2029. This widely publicized case from Northern Ireland was the subject of a book titled Let This Be Our Secret, written by Belfast journalist Derek Henderson. It was later adapted into a Northern Irish television miniseries called The Secret, which aired first on ITV, then on Netflix in 2016. It was a miniseries that Colin was able to watch from his prison cell. According to prison officials, once he completed his chores, drank his tea, and said his prayers, the 57-year-old settled in to watch the show on the 16-inch color TV in his cell. His lawyer disputed that claim and said Colin had not watched the series. But prison insiders insisted that he reveled in the production, feeling that the story moved him up the notoriety chain in jail. They said that he tries to come off as modest, but they know exactly what he's like. And that's it for this case. What are your thoughts about Colin Howell, always ready with solutions that had no limits whatsoever? And both Hazel and Kyle, who were somehow able to sleep next to Colin every night and not wonder whether they might someday meet the same fate should they ever become Colin's inconvenience. Let us know your thoughts in the comments about this clumsy and arrogant murder that somehow still resulted in the killers getting away with it for nearly 20 years. And if you like how we presented this case, we'd really appreciate it if you take a quick moment to hit like and share, and of course, hit subscribe to be notified about any future videos.